He lived in silence until 3 Apache women changed his fate forever. White heavy check mark. He had grown up in a small town surrounded by hills, deserts, and endless stretches of sky. Nature had been his first teacher, and in its silence he found company. Birds chirped, winds whispered through the dry grass, and the distant mountains stood like guardians watching over him. He would often sit on the porch of his small cabin, listening to the soft rustle of leaves or the hum of insects at dusk. For most people, such moments were small, almost forgettable. For Daniel, they were the lifelines that kept him grounded. As a boy, Daniel had been lively, full of laughter and curious about the world, but something had happened that changed everything. A tragedy, sudden and sharp, left him feeling that words could not capture the pain he carried. Since then, silence had become his closest friend. In silence, he could control the world around him. In silence, he could think, remember, and mourn without interruption. He avoided crowded places and rarely spoke unless it was necessary. Over time, people learned not to ask too many questions or push him into conversations. They respected, or feared, his quiet presence. Daniel's home was modest but full of character. It was a small wooden cabin tucked into the edge of a desert valley. Its walls were lined with shelves of books, worn from frequent reading, and the furniture was simple but sturdy. A small fireplace offered warmth during the cold nights, and a single rocking chair sat by the window. Outside, a garden grew in neat patches. Daniel had a special fondness for plants. He loved watching them grow, seeing their leaves stretch toward the sun, and feeling the soil between his fingers. Gardening gave him a sense of purpose and a connection to life that words could not provide. His days followed a quiet rhythm. He woke with the sun, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat outside watching the desert wake up. He would walk along the dry trails, observing the patterns of the wind on the sand, listening to the distant cries of coyotes, and occasionally spotting a lone rabbit or lizard. Each walk reminded him of how vast and beautiful the world could be, even when he felt small within it. The world was alive, and he felt part of its gentle pulse, even if he did not speak to anyone about it. Despite his quiet life, Daniel was not lonely in the way many would think. He found companionship in small things. A bird that perched on his windowsill each morning became a familiar friend. The humming of bees in the flowers comforted him. The night sky, with its countless stars, offered endless wonder. He would spend hours tracing constellations with his eyes, wondering about the stories behind them, imagining the lives of those who had looked at the same stars centuries ago. In these moments, silence was not empty. It was full of thought, reflection, and sometimes gentle longing. Daniel's routine was predictable, and he liked it that way. He knew the rhythm of his days as surely as the sun knew to rise. But sometimes, even predictable lives are interrupted. He had no reason to expect anything different from the days he had grown used to. Yet deep inside, a small part of him wondered what it would be like to speak freely again, to laugh without fear, to share his thoughts with someone who might truly listen. But that part was cautious. It had been wounded before, and wounds like his took time to heal. In his quiet moments, Daniel often thought about his family and childhood friends. Most had moved away, found lives in busy cities, and forgotten the slow pace of the desert. Letters were rare, and phone calls even rarer. Sometimes he would feel a pang of longing for the connections he had lost, but it was always mixed with a sense of relief. Relationships, he had learned, could bring both joy and pain. By living in silence, he had protected himself from the heartbreak of loss and disappointment. Inside his cabin, he kept a journal, though not many people knew about it. The journal was filled with sketches, reflections, and observations about the world around him. Sometimes he wrote about the shapes of clouds, the way sunlight fell on the desert floor, or the soft sound of wind through the canyon. Other times, he wrote about memories he could not share aloud, memories of loss, of mistakes, and of moments when he felt powerless. Writing gave him a way to speak without speaking, to release the thoughts that crowded his mind. Even though Daniel lived in a world of silence, he was not completely cut off from others. Occasionally, he would visit the small town nearby for supplies. He would speak politely to shopkeepers, nodding in acknowledgement but never lingered. He preferred to keep interactions short, efficient, and without unnecessary chatter. People noticed his quiet nature, some with curiosity, others with caution. Children sometimes stared at him, fascinated by the calm presence he carried. Older townsfolk respected him for his self-sufficiency and the gentle dignity in his quietude. Daniel's silence was both armor and freedom. It protected him from the chaos of the outside world, but also kept him at a distance from its joys. He often thought about what it would be like to change, to break out of the habits that had become so ingrained. Yet the thought of doing so was intimidating. Change required trust, vulnerability, and courage, things he had learned to keep tightly locked away. But even in his self-imposed solitude, there was a quiet hope, like a seed buried deep in the soil, waiting for the right moment to grow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the desert, Daniel would often sit on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching the sky change colors. The world felt infinite, mysterious, and sometimes overwhelming. He would breathe deeply, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs, and listen to the distant sounds of life. An owl calling, the wind whispering, the faint rustle of animals in the brush. In these moments, silence was not loneliness. It was understanding, reflection, and peace. At night, Daniel would light a small lantern, its warm glow filling the cabin with soft light. He would read, write, or simply sit in contemplation. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by dreams that sometimes brought comfort, other times sorrow. But he had learned to live with both, finding a fragile balance in his quiet life. And though he would never admit it aloud, a part of him longed for something more, a connection, an event, or a person who could slowly draw him out of the silence he had lived in for so long. And so Daniel's life continued, calm and quiet like the desert around him. The world outside moved at its own pace, full of noise, conversations, and chaos. But inside his small cabin in the heart of the Arizona desert, time seemed to slow. Daniel lived each day with careful attention, finding beauty in simplicity and meaning in small moments. Little did he know, the rhythm of his life was about to change, gently but irrevocably, with the arrival of 3 women who would challenge everything he had built in silence. Daniel's quiet world had always been predictable, comfortable in its own way, but life, as he would soon discover, had a way of introducing the unexpected. One late afternoon, as he wandered along the dusty trails that wound through the edge of the desert, he noticed something unusual. The air carried voices, soft but distinct, filled with laughter and conversation, a sound that for years had seemed foreign and almost threatening to him. He paused, his heart quickening slightly. Curious but cautious, he followed the voices from a distance, careful not to reveal himself. As he crested a small hill, he saw them. 3 women, moving gracefully through the desert, their clothing simple yet striking, adorned with subtle patterns and colors that reflected the beauty of their heritage. They were exploring the area, taking notes, and occasionally speaking in gentle tones that Daniel could not fully understand, but the warmth in their voices was unmistakable. He felt a strange pull toward them, a mixture of fascination and apprehension. For the first time in years, he felt drawn out of his solitude, not entirely sure why. The women noticed him almost immediately. Their eyes met his, but instead of fear or suspicion, there was an openness that surprised him. One of them, the tallest with long dark hair and an easy smile, stepped forward slightly, offering a greeting. Daniel, unsure of how to respond, simply nodded. Words felt heavy on his tongue, unfamiliar after so long of silence. but he felt no threat in their presence, only an inexplicable sense of curiosity and kindness that stirred something deep inside him. The women introduced themselves slowly and deliberately. Their names, Yana, Nayeli, and Tayanita, were spoken with care, each syllable carrying a rhythm that seemed to echo the land around them. They explained that they were visiting from a nearby Apache reservation, working on cultural research and storytelling projects. Their goal was simple: to learn about the land, its history, and the stories it held, and perhaps to share their own traditions with others. Daniel listened quietly, absorbing each word without speaking. He was not sure if he was ready to engage, but he could not look away. Over the following days, Daniel observed the women from a distance. They moved through the desert with a natural ease, respectful of the land and each other, stopping to admire flowers, sketch the outlines of cacti, or collect small stones. He noticed how they laughed freely, shared stories, and seemed completely at ease with themselves and the world around them. Their presence was unlike anything he had encountered in years. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to tremble, not from fear, but from curiosity and the faintest hint of longing for connection. One morning, as Daniel tended his garden, he saw Ayana approach. She carried a small basket of herbs and flowers, carefully chosen from the surrounding desert. Without a word, she set the basket at the edge of his garden and gave a slight nod before retreating. Daniel stared at the gift, unsure how to respond. It was simple, thoughtful, and entirely unexpected. He had been alone for so long that even small gestures carried enormous significance. In that moment, he realized that these women were not like others he had encountered. They did not demand attention or force conversation. They simply existed in a way that invited trust. Curiosity eventually overcame Daniel's hesitation. One day, he decided to speak. His voice was quiet at first, hesitant, as though testing the air for safety. "Hello," he said. The women turned, smiles spreading across their faces. "Hello," Yana replied softly. "We have seen you walking nearby. Are you from around here?" Her tone was gentle, encouraging, without pressure or expectation. Daniel nodded. "I live here," he said simply. That was all he could manage at first, but the act of speaking, even a few words, felt liberating in a way he had forgotten was possible. The three women were patient. They did not push him into conversation, understanding that silence could be a language of its own. They began to include him in small ways, sharing water on long walks, pointing out interesting plants, and telling short stories about the land. Daniel listened, slowly learning to trust their presence. He began to ask questions in return, small and tentative, about their lives, the plants they collected, and the songs they hummed. With each interaction, he discovered that speaking did not have to be difficult or dangerous. It could be gentle, deliberate, and even comforting. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's connection with the women deepened. They invited him to join them in small rituals that honored the land, such as offering water to a young sapling, tracing patterns in the sand, or observing the movements of the sun and stars. At first, he participated hesitantly, unsure if he truly belonged. But the women's patience and encouragement allowed him to relax. He realized that he did not need to hide behind silence to be safe. The world could be generous, and trust could be nurtured, one small step at a time. The women also shared stories from their own lives. Yana spoke of her childhood, the lessons taught by her elders, and the ways her people maintained a connection to the land. Nayeli described challenges she had faced, moments of loss, and how she had found strength in community. Tayanita, the youngest of the three, often shared tales of curiosity and wonder, the small joys she discovered every day. Through their stories, Daniel began to understand that strength and resilience could take many forms, and that silence, while protective, was not the only way to navigate life. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Daniel found himself walking alongside the women, listening to their laughter and stories. A cool breeze carried the scent of desert sage, and the horizon glowed in soft oranges and purples. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging. He did not need to speak at length. Simply being present, observing, and listening was enough. The women had a way of making him feel included without demanding more than he could give. It was a subtle, profound lesson. Connection did not have to be loud or forced. Through their presence, Daniel also began to notice small changes within himself. He started to speak more frequently, first in whispers, then in sentences, and finally in conversations that felt natural. He laughed again, tentatively at first, then more freely, discovering a sound he had almost forgotten. The women never judged or criticized. They simply accepted him as he was, allowing him to rediscover his voice at his own pace. With each passing day, Daniel felt lighter, as though the weight of years spent in silence was slowly lifting. Yet, it was not only about speaking. The women taught him to observe life in new ways. They showed him the beauty in small moments, the way sunlight danced on a spider's web, the delicate patterns of desert rocks, or the soft murmur of a distant stream. They encouraged him to sketch, to write, and to share his thoughts in ways that did not always require words. Daniel found joy in these creative expressions, realizing that communication could be flexible, gentle, and deeply fulfilling. As their bond grew, Daniel began to open up about his past, not in full detail, but in fragments that felt safe. He spoke of the tragedy that had led him into silence, of the fear and pain he had carried for so long, and of the loneliness that had become a constant companion. The women listened without judgment, offering empathy and understanding. Their presence became a sanctuary, a space where he could confront his past without fear of being overwhelmed. For the first time, Daniel felt that his pain could be acknowledged, not ignored, and that sharing it could be a source of healing rather than shame. The women also shared their wisdom about resilience and courage. They taught him that strength was not measured by the absence of fear or sorrow, but by the willingness to face life despite them. They spoke of traditions, rituals, and values that had guided their people for generations, emphasizing respect, patience, and the importance of community. Daniel absorbed these lessons quietly, letting them settle in his heart, realizing that his life did not have to remain solitary to be meaningful. By the end of the second part of this unfolding story, Daniel's life had begun to transform. The once solitary man, who had spent years hiding behind walls of silence, now felt the stirrings of hope and curiosity. The three Apache women had become more than companions. They were guides, teachers, and friends, gently leading him toward a life filled with connection, trust, and the possibility of joy. The desert, once a landscape of quiet reflection and isolation, now felt alive with potential. Each day brought new discoveries, small adventures, and the promise of growth. Daniel had begun to understand that life was not something to be feared, even with its challenges and uncertainties. With the guidance of Ayana, Nayeli, and Tayanita, he realized that connection, laughter, and shared stories were not only possible, they were essential to living fully. And so, Daniel's world expanded, slowly and carefully, as he took tentative steps toward a future he had never imagined. The women had arrived unexpectedly, like a gentle breeze in the stillness of his life, and in their presence, he found the courage to begin speaking, to begin trusting, and to begin living again. The mornings in Daniel's life had started to feel different. The sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. But now, instead of walking alone in silent reflection, he walked alongside the three women, Ayana, Nayeli, and Tayanita. Each step he took felt lighter, not because the desert had changed, but because his world was slowly being filled with warmth, guidance, and the gentle wisdom of their presence. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible at first, yet it was deep and enduring. He was beginning to understand that life had more to offer than silence and solitude. The three women had started to introduce Daniel to their traditions in small, deliberate ways. Yana spoke about the importance of storytelling in Apache culture, how stories were not just entertainment, but a way to preserve history, values, and lessons for future generations. She showed him how to listen, not just with ears but with the heart, so that the stories could be understood fully, not only through words but through the feelings they carried. Daniel found this concept fascinating. He had always thought that stories required speaking or writing, but now he realized that understanding and empathy were just as powerful as words. Nayeli, meanwhile, focused on practical lessons in resilience. She had faced many challenges in her own life, and through her examples, Daniel began to see that strength was not measured by the absence of fear or sorrow, but by the willingness to continue, to adapt, and to care for oneself and others despite difficulties. She encouraged Daniel to take small risks, to try things he had avoided for years, and to embrace the unknown. They started with simple tasks, building a small shelter to observe birds, gathering medicinal herbs, or walking along unfamiliar trails. Each activity was a lesson in courage, patience, and observation. Daniel often felt nervous at first, but the women's calm guidance gave him confidence. Tayanita brought a sense of wonder and curiosity into Daniel's life that he had long forgotten. She delighted in small discoveries, a rare desert flower, the tracks of a fox in the sand, the way sunlight reflected on a cactus spire. She encouraged Daniel to sketch what he saw, to write down the patterns of nature, and to notice details he had previously ignored. Through her eyes, the desert became a classroom, a place full of lessons waiting to be discovered. Daniel realized that he had lived for years in the same landscape, but had barely noticed its beauty. Now each day brought new insights, new patterns, and new feelings of connection to the world around him. One afternoon, the women guided Daniel to a nearby canyon. The walls of the canyon rose high above them, carved by years of wind and water into smooth, graceful curves. Sunlight filtered through narrow openings, casting patterns on the sandy floor. Here, they introduced him to a traditional Apache practice, a ritual of gratitude and reflection. They asked Daniel to sit quietly, close his eyes, and think about the things he was thankful for, both big and small. At first, Daniel found it difficult. He had spent so long thinking in terms of survival and avoidance that gratitude felt foreign. But with gentle encouragement, he began to recognize the small joys he had overlooked: sunlight on his face, the taste of sweet water, the sound of birds in the distance. This ritual became a turning point for Daniel. He began to understand that resilience was not only about enduring pain, but also about recognizing beauty and strength in daily life. The women's teachings were not lectures. They were experiences, lessons embedded in living, breathing reality. Daniel learned to listen carefully, not only to them but to the land itself. The rustle of leaves, the wind sweeping through rocks, the distant call of an eagle, all became messages, gentle reminders of the world's resilience and his own. In the evenings, they would sit around a small fire, and the women would share stories of their ancestors. Iana spoke of a great-grandmother who had led her people with wisdom and courage, protecting traditions while embracing change. Nayeli shared a story about overcoming hardship, about how communities survive when individuals come together to support one another. Tayanita, in her quiet and curious way, often asked questions that led to reflection, encouraging Daniel to consider his own life and the choices he had made. Daniel listened intently, absorbing these stories not as a passive observer but as an active participant in a dialogue about life, strength, and hope. Through these interactions, Daniel began to recognize parallels in his own experiences. He saw that his years of silence, while protective, had also limited his growth. He realized that by trusting others, by opening himself to connection, he could begin to heal and to discover strength he had not known existed. The women never pressured him to share more than he was ready to. Instead, they modeled courage, patience, and compassion in every action, showing him that resilience was not a solitary act but a shared one. One day, the women asked Daniel to help them collect plants and herbs used in traditional medicine. At first, he was hesitant, unsure of his knowledge or ability to contribute. But they guided him with patience, showing how to identify the plants, understand their uses, and handle them with respect. As he worked, Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment he had not experienced in years. These simple tasks, infused with purpose and tradition, helped him understand that resilience was not only about enduring hardship, but also about contributing, learning, and connecting with the world around him. Daniel also began to experiment with expressing himself creatively. He had always loved drawing and writing, but had abandoned these hobbies as life's demands and grief had taken over. Encouraged by the women, he sketched the desert landscapes, the intricate patterns of rocks and leaves, and even the small gestures of daily life he had previously overlooked. He wrote short reflections about his experiences, capturing moments of beauty, challenges, and emotions. Through these exercises, he found that his voice, long silent, could emerge in different forms, offering both expression and relief. The women also introduced him to the power of song. Gianna would hum ancient melodies and Anita would sing softly, encouraging Daniel to join in any way he felt comfortable. At first, he remained silent, unsure of how to use his voice. But gradually he began to hum along, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Music, he realized, could communicate feelings that words sometimes failed to convey. It was a bridge between silence and speech, a way to connect deeply with others and with the world around him. As the weeks passed, Daniel's transformation became more evident to himself and to the women. He laughed more freely, spoke with greater confidence, and engaged with the world in ways he had long avoided. The desert, once a place of solitude and reflection, had become a place of learning, growth, and connection. Daniel had discovered that resilience was not merely about surviving. It was about embracing life, with all its challenges and wonders, and finding strength through connection, understanding, and creativity. But this journey was not without moments of struggle. There were times when memories of his past grief surfaced, when fear and doubt crept back into his mind, threatening to undo the progress he had made. During these moments, the women's presence became crucial. They offered gentle encouragement, reminding him that strength was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue despite it. They guided him in breathing exercises, meditative reflection, and simple acts of mindfulness, helping him navigate the waves of emotion without becoming overwhelmed. Through these experiences, Daniel began to form a deep bond with each of the women. Gianna's wisdom and gentle guidance taught him patience and understanding. Naeli's strength and courage inspired him to face challenges without retreating. Anita's curiosity and joy reminded him to see life through fresh eyes, to find wonder in the smallest moments. Together, they became his teachers, his friends, and his support system, showing him that resilience and growth could be nurtured through shared experiences and mutual care. By the end of this stage in his journey, Daniel had begun to reclaim parts of himself he had long forgotten. He spoke more freely, laughed without fear, and engaged with the world around him in ways he had not thought possible. The lessons of the three women had not only helped him heal, but had also prepared him to face the challenges of the future with courage and grace. The silence that had once defined his life was no longer a prison. It had become a space of reflection, learning, and eventual renewal. In quiet moments, Daniel often reflected on the journey so far. He realized that the greatest lesson he had learned was not about courage, storytelling, or even resilience in isolation, but about the power of connection. Through trust, patience, and shared experience, he had discovered that human bonds could heal wounds that time alone could not. He had learned that life was not meant to be endured in silence, but to be experienced fully, with both its joys and its sorrows. And so, Daniel's life continued to evolve, guided by the gentle, unwavering presence of Ayanna, Nayeli, and Tayanita. He had begun to see the world not as a place to hide from, but as a place to explore, understand, and cherish. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new joys. Through their wisdom, he had begun to understand that resilience was not merely surviving but living fully, with courage, curiosity, and a willingness to embrace connection. As Daniel continued his life among the three women, a quiet transformation was taking place. His days were filled with laughter, learning, and moments of reflection, yet beneath the surface, shadows of the past remained. Memories he had long kept locked away began to resurface, subtle at first, a fleeting image, a sudden feeling, a whisper of sorrow, but gradually they became harder to ignore. The silence that had once been his refuge was no longer enough to protect him. He realized that to fully embrace life, he had to face what he had avoided for so long. It began one evening when the four of them sat near the fire after a long day of walking through the desert. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, and the desert was bathed in deep, soft shades of purple and blue. Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest, a mix of fear and anticipation. The women noticed his quiet mood. Gianna, sensing his hesitation, asked gently, "What is on your mind, Daniel?" He hesitated, unsure if he was ready to speak aloud the pain he had carried for so long. Yet for the first time, he felt a spark of trust that made him consider sharing even the smallest piece of his burden. Slowly, he began to speak, his voice trembling at first. He spoke of the tragedy that had caused him to retreat from the world, of the sorrow that had shaped his life, and of the years spent in silence to protect himself from further pain. His words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. The women listened without interruption, their expressions filled with empathy. They did not offer immediate solutions or try to change his feelings. Instead, they provided the space for him to speak freely, validating his experience simply by being present and attentive. Gianna suggested a walk, a ritual of facing the past in the presence of nature. They guided Daniel to a quiet canyon, a place where the wind moved freely and the shadows of rocks stretched across the sand. There, they asked him to confront his memories, not to relive the pain, but to acknowledge it, to see it as part of his story rather than something to be hidden. Daniel was hesitant. Fear gripped him as he imagined opening old wounds, but the presence of the women reassured him. Step by step, he began to speak aloud fragments of his past, naming the moments that had haunted him and the feelings he had tried to bury. Through this process, Daniel realized that confronting pain did not make it stronger, it made him stronger. The act of facing memories with honesty, in a safe and supportive environment, allowed him to release some of the weight he had carried alone for so many years. The women shared their own experiences of hardship, showing him that resilience was built not by avoiding pain but by engaging with it, learning from it, and allowing oneself to heal gradually. One day, they brought Daniel to a sacred spring hidden deep within the canyon. The water was clear and calm, reflecting the sky above. The women explained that water had always been a symbol of cleansing and renewal in their culture. They encouraged Daniel to approach the spring, to speak aloud his fears, regrets, and grief, and then to release them into the water. At first, Daniel hesitated. He felt the weight of decades pressing on him, unsure if he could let go. But with the patient guidance of Ayanna, Nayeli, and Tayanita, he stepped closer, speaking softly into the wind, allowing the words to carry his sorrow away. As he poured his heart into the ritual, Daniel felt a lightness he had not known in years. Tears flowed freely, not as a sign of weakness, but as a release of the pain he had carried alone for so long. The women stayed by his side, offering silent support, their presence reminding him that he was not alone. In that moment, he understood that facing the past did not erase it, but it transformed it, from a source of shame and isolation into a source of strength and insight. The women also introduced Daniel to journaling as a tool for confronting emotions. They encouraged him to write down not only his memories, but also his feelings about those experiences. At first, he found it difficult to express the depth of his emotions on paper, but gradually, words flowed more freely. Each page became a testament to his courage and resilience, a record of his journey from silence to self-awareness. Through writing, Daniel discovered that reflection was not a passive act. It was a form of engagement, a way to understand oneself and navigate the complexities of life. Throughout this process, Daniel noticed small but meaningful changes in himself. He spoke with greater clarity and confidence, not only about his past but also about his hopes for the future. He laughed more freely, recognizing that joy and sorrow could coexist. He began to see patterns in life, understanding that every challenge carried lessons and opportunities for growth. The women's guidance helped him recognize that resilience was not about being untouched by pain, but about learning to move forward despite it, embracing both the light and shadow in life. There were difficult days, of course. Memories sometimes returned unexpectedly, triggered by a sound, a smell, or a quiet moment alone. Daniel would feel the familiar grip of fear and grief, wondering if he was strong enough to continue. Yet each time the women were there, Iana with her gentle wisdom, Naeli with her encouragement, and Tayanita with her quiet curiosity and optimism. They reminded him that healing was a journey, not a race, and that every small step forward was meaningful. Daniel learned to be patient with himself, to allow emotions to arise without judgment, and to recognize that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. In addition to facing his personal past, Daniel began to reflect on the way he had interacted with the world. He realized that his years of silence, while protective, had also limited his experiences and relationships. The lessons from the women showed him that connection was not inherently dangerous. It could be nurturing, inspiring, and transformative. Slowly, he started to reach out to others, first in small ways, acknowledging a neighbor, sharing a simple conversation in town, or helping someone with a task. Each interaction, no matter how brief, reinforced the lessons he had learned about trust, courage, and the value of human connection. The women also encouraged Daniel to participate in community rituals and gatherings. They explained the significance of sharing stories, songs, and experiences with others, emphasizing that connection and resilience were intertwined. At first, Daniel felt nervous, unsure if he belonged, but the women's guidance gave him the courage to engage. He discovered that his voice mattered, that his experiences could offer insight and empathy to others, and that he could find belonging without sacrificing his authenticity. One particularly memorable day, they visited a rock formation that had been a historical site for generations. The women shared stories of their ancestors, who had faced hardships with courage and wisdom. They asked Daniel to reflect on his own journey, to consider how he had grown, and to recognize the strength he had gained through both suffering and learning. Standing there, surrounded by the vast desert and the echoes of history, Daniel felt a deep sense of connection, to the land, to the women, and to the continuity of life. He understood that confronting his past had not only freed him, but had also allowed him to engage more fully with the present and the future. By the end of this period, Daniel had begun to integrate the lessons of his past with the new life he was building. He had faced the pain he had carried for so long, learned to release it, and discovered ways to transform it into wisdom, strength, and empathy. The women had guided him through this process with patience, understanding, and care, showing him that healing was possible when supported by trust, compassion, and shared experience. Daniel realized that the greatest gift he had received from Ayana, Naeli, and Tayanita was not only guidance or friendship, but the ability to face himself fully, to confront the shadows of his past without fear, and to recognize the resilience within him. The silence that had once defined his life was no longer a cage but a space for reflection, growth, and renewal. He had learned that facing the past was not a sign of weakness, but a courageous step toward living a fuller, richer life. As the desert sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Daniel felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He knew that challenges would continue to arise, and that life would not always be easy. But he also knew that he had the tools, the wisdom, and the support to navigate those challenges with courage and grace. The women had not only helped him confront his past, they had shown him a path toward a future filled with hope, connection, and resilience. And so, Daniel's life continued, marked by growth, understanding, and the quiet but profound transformation that comes from facing one's fears and learning to trust in the guidance of others. He was no longer defined solely by his silence or his past grief. Instead, he was becoming a man who could engage with the world fully, who could experience both sorrow and joy, and who could find strength and meaning in connection, reflection, and shared human experience. The desert had always been Daniel's companion, vast and quiet, filled with sunlight, shadows, and the subtle rhythms of nature. But over the past months, it had become more than a backdrop to his solitude. It had become a place of transformation, a landscape that reflected his journey from silence and sorrow to connection, courage, and hope. With the guidance of Ayana, Naeli, and Tayanita, Daniel had not only faced the pain of his past, but had also discovered the strength to embrace life fully. And now, he began to live in a way he had never imagined possible. Each morning, Daniel woke with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. He joined the women in their daily rituals, walking through the desert trails, observing the subtle patterns of life around him, and engaging with the land in ways that felt both natural and purposeful. He spoke freely, shared stories of his reflections, and even laughed aloud, the sound echoing across the open plains. The silence that had once defined him was no longer a shield of fear but a conscious choice, a space for reflection, for peace, and for deliberate listening to the world and the people he cared about. Daniel's bond with the three women had grown deeper than friendship. They had become his guides, his confidants, and his family of choice. Yana's wisdom continued to anchor him, showing him how to balance reflection with action and how to approach life with patience and understanding. Naeli's strength inspired him to face challenges with courage, to take responsibility for his choices, and to find power in vulnerability. Tayanita's curiosity reminded him to see beauty in the small details of life, to embrace wonder and joy even in ordinary moments. Together, they had helped him reshape his world. One day, the women invited Daniel to a small gathering on the edge of the reservation. It was a simple celebration, a coming together of neighbors, friends, and families, filled with music, food, and storytelling. At first, Daniel felt a pang of nervousness. Speaking in front of others, engaging with a group, these were activities he would have avoided just months before. Yet, the women's presence beside him gave him courage. He realized that he was no longer alone, and that connection could be safe, fulfilling, and even joyful. During the gathering, Daniel shared a story from his life, a fragment of his journey from silence, the lessons he had learned, and the strength he had discovered through struggle and reflection. The listeners were attentive, nodding, smiling, and sometimes laughing softly at his moments of humor. As he spoke, Daniel felt a sense of liberation unlike anything he had experienced before. Words, once heavy and frightening, now flowed freely, carrying his experiences into the hearts of others. The act of sharing, of being heard and understood, was deeply healing, reinforcing the lessons of resilience and connection he had learned from the women. The women also encouraged Daniel to participate in cultural activities, such as traditional dances, songs, and crafts. Initially hesitant, he found himself drawn to the rhythm of the drums, the melodies of the songs, and the intricate designs of the crafts. Each activity became a lesson, not just in skill, but in patience, observation, and engagement with the community. Daniel discovered that learning alongside others, contributing to shared experiences, and celebrating cultural traditions could bring profound joy and meaning. He began to feel a sense of belonging that he had never known, a recognition that life was richer when shared. As the weeks passed, Daniel noticed profound changes within himself. He felt more confident in his interactions with others, more willing to take risks, and more open to new experiences. The fears and doubts that had once kept him isolated no longer held the same power over him. He could confront challenges with a sense of calm and determination, knowing that he had the support of the women and the tools to navigate life with resilience and wisdom. Even when difficult emotions arose, he could face them, reflect, and move forward with courage. One afternoon, the group decided to explore a distant canyon, a place few had visited. The journey was long and challenging, with rocky paths and steep inclines. Daniel's first instinct was hesitation, but with Ayana's guidance, Nayeli's encouragement, and Tayanita's cheerful support, he found himself pushing forward. Each step became a metaphor for his journey, overcoming fear, embracing effort, and trusting in his abilities. When they reached the top, the view took Daniel's breath away, a panorama of desert, mountains, and sky stretching endlessly in every direction. In that moment, he realized how far he had come, both physically and emotionally. The three women encouraged Daniel to reflect on this journey. "Every step you took," Yana said softly, "was a step toward yourself. You faced fear, embraced challenge, and discovered courage you didn't know you had." Nayeli added, "Strength is not about never feeling afraid. It is about continuing forward despite the fear." Tayanita smiled and said, "And sometimes it's about seeing the beauty in the journey, even when it's hard." Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the women but for his own perseverance. He understood that his transformation had been gradual, shaped by patience, guidance, and consistent effort. Over time, Daniel became more active in the community. He shared his skills in gardening, writing, and observation of the land. He helped younger members of the community with small projects, teaching them what he had learned about patience, resilience, and appreciation for the natural world. In return, he learned from them, discovering fresh perspectives, new ideas, and a renewed sense of purpose. The bonds he formed were genuine and lasting, rooted in mutual respect and shared experience. He realized that life, when lived fully, was not a solitary endeavor but a series of connections, each contributing to personal growth and communal strength. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Daniel sat with the women on a rocky outcrop, looking out over the desert. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple, reflecting on the rocks and casting long shadows across the sand. He felt a profound sense of peace. The journey he had undertaken, from silence to speech, from isolation to connection, from fear to courage, had been transformative. He realized that his life had been forever changed by the presence of these three extraordinary women, who had guided him gently, patiently, and unconditionally toward a fuller, richer existence. Daniel reflected on the lessons he had learned. He understood that silence could be a refuge, but connection was essential for growth. Pain could shape life, but resilience, courage, and openness could transform it into strength. Vulnerability was not a weakness but a bridge to meaningful relationships. And most importantly, he recognized that life was not meant to be endured alone. It was meant to be shared, celebrated, and embraced with trust and empathy. The women had not only changed his life, they had taught him how to live it fully. Daniel now approached each day with intention, mindful of the beauty around him and the relationships he had nurtured. He spoke openly, laughed freely, and engaged deeply with both the land and the people he cared about. The fear that had once dominated his life no longer controlled him. Instead, it had been replaced with confidence, curiosity, and gratitude. As the night settled over the desert, Daniel often found himself gazing at the stars, recalling the long nights of solitude he had once known. Now, however, the stars were not symbols of isolation, but of connection. Each star reminded him of the people, experiences, and lessons that had guided him to this moment. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the women who had changed his life, but for his own willingness to face the past, embrace growth, and trust in the journey ahead. In the days and weeks that followed, Daniel continued to live intentionally, blending reflection, action, and connection. He maintained his garden, explored new trails, shared stories, and participated in community events. He encouraged others to find their own voices, to face their fears, and to embrace both joy and sorrow as integral parts of life. His transformation became an inspiration, demonstrating that even after years of silence, grief, and isolation, it was possible to rebuild, grow, and thrive. Ultimately, Daniel discovered that life's most profound changes often come from unexpected sources. The three women had entered his life quietly, without force or expectation, yet their presence had sparked a transformation that touched every aspect of his being. Through their wisdom, patience, and compassion, Daniel had learned to confront his past, embrace his present, and approach the future with hope and confidence. The desert, once a symbol of solitude, had become a canvas for his growth and a witness to his transformation. The lessons he had learned, the importance of connection, courage, reflection, and gratitude, would remain with him for the rest of his life. Daniel understood that while challenges would continue to arise, he now had the tools, resilience, and support to navigate them with grace and strength. And so, Daniel's life had been forever changed. He had emerged from the shadows of silence into a world filled with connection, understanding, and purpose. The three women had guided him gently but powerfully, helping him reclaim his voice, his confidence, and his joy. And in the quiet moments, standing under the vast desert sky, he felt a sense of completeness, knowing that he had not only survived but had truly learned to live. Daniel smiled, a smile that was full of hope, gratitude, and peace. The journey that had begun in solitude and fear had led him to a life rich with relationships, experiences, and inner strength. He knew that the world was vast, full of beauty and challenge, but he was no longer afraid. He had been forever changed by the courage, wisdom, and love of three extraordinary women, and through them, he had discovered the strength within himself to live fully, openly, and joyfully.